Imagine waking up one morning, and the bank where your life savings sits is closed. The sky turns black at noon, not from nightfall, but from a wall of dust taller than a skyscraper. Gangsters become celebrities, Hollywood explodes in color, and a 7-foot robot promises the world of tomorrow. This isn't fiction. This is the 1930s, and it might be the strangest decade in modern history. Let's get right in. Please consider subscribing if you like this video. The 1930s did not gently enter history. They kicked the door down. It began with the aftershock of the 1929 stock market crash, and by 1930, the world was in full economic freefall. Banks collapsed, businesses shuttered, life savings vanished overnight. In the United States, nearly 1 out of every 4 people was unemployed. Entire towns built around single factories just stopped. People sold apples on street corners. Families packed their lives into suitcases and left homes they would never see again. Makeshift communities called Hoovervilles sprang up in vacant lots, sarcastically named after President Herbert Hoover, who many blamed for the disaster. And it wasn't just America. The Great Depression rippled across Europe, Latin America, and beyond. Global trade shrank. Governments panicked. Political extremism began to rise. The 1930s opened with hunger, dust storms, and uncertainty. But here's what makes the decade strange. Even while the world struggled to survive, this same decade produced swing music, Hollywood glamour, surreal inventions, massive public works, and some of the boldest social experiments in history. The 1930s were both desperate and wildly creative. And that tension? That's where things get interesting. If the Great Depression wasn't bad enough, nature decided to join the chaos. In the early 1930s, years of aggressive farming across the Great Plains stripped the land of its natural grasses. Farmers had plowed millions of acres, encouraged by high crop prices during World War I. But when drought hit, there was nothing left to hold the soil down. And that soil took flight. Massive dust storms, some over a mile high, rolled across states like Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas, and Colorado. Entire skies turned black in the middle of the day. People described it as watching a wall of earth swallow the horizon. One of the worst storms struck on April 14, 1935, a day known as Black Sunday. Winds reached up to 60 miles per hour, carrying millions of tons of dirt across the country. Dust crept through windows. It coated food. It filled lungs. Children slept with wet cloths over their faces just to breathe. Livestock suffocated. Crops failed. Farms disappeared. Hundreds of thousands of families packed what little they had and headed west, especially to California, hoping to find work. Many never did. The 1930s weren't just an economic crisis. They were environmental disaster, migration crisis, and survival story all in one. It looked less like history and more like a scene from a modern dystopian film. Except this was real, and it reshaped America forever. While farmers were fighting dust storms, cities were fighting something else entirely. Crime had a glow-up. Prohibition had technically started in the 1920s, but by the early 1930s, organized crime was thriving. Illegal alcohol created underground empires. Speakeasies flourished. Bootleggers became businessmen, just with better aim. And then came the legends. In Chicago, Al Capone wasn't just a criminal. He was practically a celebrity. Tailored suits, public interviews, charity donations. He ran a multi-million-dollar bootlegging empire during the worst economic collapse in modern history. Until he was finally taken down, not for murder, but for tax evasion. Meanwhile, across the Midwest, Bonnie and Clyde were turning bank robbery into headline romance. Newspapers glamorized them. The public followed their story like a movie serial. The strange part? People struggling in poverty sometimes rooted for them. Banks had foreclosed on homes. Jobs were gone. Institutions had failed. So when outlaws robbed those institutions, some saw them as rebellious anti-heroes. By the mid-1930s, the FBI, led by J. Edgar Hoover, began transforming into a modern crime-fighting machine. Fingerprinting, forensic labs, centralized records. The gangster era didn't just give us dramatic shootouts, it reshaped federal law enforcement forever. The 1930s made crime cinematic, but it also made justice modern. When reality became unbearable, people went to the movies. In the middle of economic collapse, something magical happened. Hollywood didn't shrink, it exploded. The 1930s became known as the golden age of Hollywood. Movie theaters were packed, even when people barely had money for food. For a few cents, audiences could step into worlds filled with elegance, romance, adventure, and happy endings. Studios like Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer and Warner Brothers turned actors into global celebrities. Glamour replaced hardship, at least on screen. And in 1939, cinema delivered one of the most iconic films of all time, The Wizard of Oz. Audiences watched Dorothy step out of black-and-white Kansas into vibrant technicolor Oz. At a time when much of America was gray and dust-covered, this explosion of color felt almost surreal. That same year, Gone with the Wind broke box office records and became a cultural phenomenon. Musicals flourished, screwball comedies thrived, gangster films dramatized the headlines. Animated films like Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs proved that feature-length animation could be a massive success. The strange contradiction? While millions were unemployed, Hollywood was building fantasy palaces and paying stars enormous salaries. The 1930s were brutal in reality, but on screen, they sparkled. And sometimes, that sparkle was exactly what people needed. By 1933, the United States had a choice: collapse or try something completely unprecedented. Enter Franklin D. Roosevelt, known simply as FDR. Within his first 100 days in office, Roosevelt launched a flood of programs that would become known as the New Deal. The goal? Put Americans back to work, stabilize banks, rebuild confidence. And he did it in ways the country had never seen before. The government started hiring millions of people directly. The Civilian Conservation Corps sent young men into forests to plant trees and build trails. The Works Progress Administration hired artists, writers, actors, and laborers alike, paying them to build roads, bridges, murals, and public buildings. And then came the megaprojects. The construction of the Hoover Dam was nothing short of monumental. Thousands of workers poured concrete in brutal desert heat, creating one of the largest dams in the world. Entire regions received electricity for the first time. The government wasn't just regulating anymore. It was building. It was experimenting. It was redefining the relationship between citizens and the state. Critics called it radical. Supporters called it life-saving. The 1930s didn't just reshape landscapes with concrete and steel. They reshaped the idea of what government could be. And whether you loved it or hated it, it changed America forever. If you thought the 1930s were only about depression and dams, think again, because this decade also got weird. Let's start with the future. In 1939, at the New York World's Fair, a 7-foot-tall talking robot named Electro wowed crowds. Built by Westinghouse Electric Corporation, Electro could walk, talk, count on his fingers, and even smoke cigarettes. To Depression-era audiences, this wasn't just a machine. It was a glimpse of tomorrow. The fair itself, themed The World of Tomorrow, promised highways in the sky, futuristic kitchens, and utopian cities, all while much of the actual world was still struggling to eat. Fashion got strange too. Women's hemlines dropped, shoulders got wider, utility met elegance. Meanwhile, strange beauty devices promised miracle transformations, including facelifting contraptions that looked suspiciously like medieval torture gear. And then there was health advice. Radioactive products were still being sold in the early 1930s. Energy tonics glowed. Doctors endorsed things that, in hindsight, should not have been endorsed. But beneath the eccentric inventions and bold designs, something darker was rising. In Europe, political extremism gained traction. In 1933, Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. Authoritarian regimes strengthened. Military expansion accelerated. By the late 1930s, tensions exploded into war with the invasion of Poland in 1939. The decade that began in economic collapse ended on the brink of global conflict. The 1930s were strange because they were transitional. Old systems were falling apart. New futures, bright and terrifying, were being built at the same time, and the world would never look the same again. The 1930s were supposed to be the end of everything. Banks collapsed, farms disappeared, crime exploded, storms swallowed entire towns. And yet, it became one of the most transformative decades in modern history. Out of economic ruin came massive infrastructure projects. Out of desperation came innovation. Out of uncertainty came art, cinema, and cultural reinvention. The 1930s didn't just survive disaster. They rebuilt, they experimented, they imagined new futures. They prepared, knowingly or not, for a world that was about to change forever. It was a decade balanced between collapse and creation, between fear and optimism, between dust storms and technicolor dreams. And maybe that's what makes it so strange, because even when everything seemed broken, people kept building. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the strangest chapters of the 1930s, stick around for the next episode of Strange History Over the Decades, where we uncover the bizarre, dramatic, and unbelievable moments that shape the world we live in today. History isn't just dates and timelines. It's chaos, it's creativity, it's survival, and it's a lot stranger than we remember. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next decade.